Pause for a moment, close your eyes, go back a few years in your memory, remember that place, that abyss you never thought you'd escape from, that addiction that controlled you, that toxic relationship that destroyed you, that suffocating depression, that pain that seemed eternal. You're here now reading this, breathing alive. Billy Graham preached something that can completely transform your life. When you remember where God brought you from, you'll stop doubting where God can take you. And in the next few minutes, you'll understand why this simple truth can unlock your entire spiritual potential. We all face a common problem in our spiritual journey: doubt about the future. We know God saved us. We know He pulled us out of a terrible place. But when we look ahead, when we look at the dreams God placed in our hearts, when we see the mountains we need to climb, we ask ourselves, can God really take me where I'm dreaming of going? It's a spiritual paradox that Billy Graham constantly identified in his crusades. People would come to God, they'd receive forgiveness, they'd experience transformation. But then, weeks or months later, when life got difficult again, when unexpected obstacles arose, when faith was tested, they'd return to doubt. Will God really sustain me? Does God really have a plan for me? Will this transformation last? Does God really love me enough to take me where I need to go? Billy Graham said the antidote to this doubt isn't more faith, more effort, or more hope. It's memory. It's you looking back and seeing the miracle God already performed in your life. He preached, if God was powerful enough to pull you out of the hell where you were, He's powerful enough to take you to the heaven you're reaching for. There's something profound about memory in the spiritual journey. Memory isn't just nostalgia. It's not just reminiscing about the good old days or how things used to be. Spiritual memory is different. Billy Graham explained that spiritual memory is an instrument of power. It's when you summon the evidence of God in your life to strengthen your faith in the present. He frequently quoted Deuteronomy. Remember all the ways the Lord your God has led you through the 40 years in the wilderness, to humble you and test you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep His commandments or not. Billy Graham preached, God was telling the people of Israel, don't forget, recall, remember every miracle I performed. Remember every time I sustained you when it seemed impossible, because when you remember, your faith will be renewed. Think about it. When you hit rock bottom, you didn't know how you'd get out. You had no plan. There was no obvious solution. You only had desperation. And then God acted. It might have been through an unexpected person. It might have been through an opportunity that appeared out of nowhere. It might have been a sudden change in circumstances. It might have simply been a change in your own heart, a spiritual awakening that gave you strength to fight again. Billy Graham said, that moment when God acted, that's one of the most important moments of your life. Not because the problem was solved, but because you saw God working, you experienced His reality, you touched the sacred. And then, Billy Graham continued, that memory becomes your spiritual fortress. The Bible is full of examples of people who used memory as a spiritual fortress. David fleeing from Saul, frightened, alone, seeing death approaching. And in one of his songs, the Psalms, he writes, I remembered everything the Lord did for me, how he delivered me from the lion and the bear when I was protecting the sheep, how he was with me. And I thought, if God was faithful when I was just a boy shepherding sheep, he'll be faithful now when I'm being pursued by the king. In that memory, David found courage. The women who went to the risen tomb, they had seen Jesus die, saw his body taken from them. Their despair was complete. But then an angel said, "Why do you seek among the dead one who is alive? Remember what he told you when he was still in Galilee. He said the Son of Man would be delivered into the hands of sinful men, would be crucified, but on the third day would rise again." In that recollection, the women found hope. Billy Graham explained, "Memory is like a coat rack where you hang your faith. When doubt comes, when fear comes, when everything around you seems dark, you have something to hold on to. You have the memory of when God acted, and that memory sustains you." Now let's be specific. When Billy Graham said, "when you remember where God brought you from," he was talking about very real places. Places of perdition, places of destruction, places you never thought you'd leave. Addiction. There's someone reading this now who was addicted, maybe still is. You know what it's like to wake up and have that be the first thing you think about. That addiction, that habit you hate but can't stop. Billy Graham preached to crowds of addicts, and he said, "You think you're trapped in this slavery forever. You think you'll never get out of here. You've tried everything. You've made all the promises. You've cried all your tears, and still that demon always comes back." But then Billy Graham would turn to the stories, to the memories, to the man who went from God's house to the street, consumed by alcohol, who lost his family, his job, his dignity, and in a final act of desperation entered a Billy Graham tabernacle, drunk, filthy, hopeless, and found Jesus. Billy Graham described, he left that tabernacle a different man, not because the addiction magically disappeared, but because he experienced the power of God. And that salvation experience became his memory, and every time temptation returned, he remembered, "I was pulled from the abyss. God rescued me once. He can sustain me again." Destroyed relationships. There's someone whose life was shattered by relationships. Billy Graham preached, you loved someone with everything you had, and that love was rejected, or worse, it was exploited. You were betrayed, you were humiliated, you were abandoned, and you thought, I'll never love again. I'll never trust again. My heart is too broken. But then God acted. It might have taken months, it might have taken years, but you began to heal. The anger diminished, the hatred lost its venom, and one day you discovered yourself capable of loving again, capable of trusting again, capable of opening up again. Billy Graham said, that healing is a miracle. That recovery is God's work in you. And when you remember that God restored your heart, you'll stop doubting whether he can lead you to a healthy relationship, because he's already shown you he can heal broken hearts. Failures and setbacks. There are those who experienced absolute failure. You built something, a career, a business, a dream, and it all collapsed. Billy Graham preached to people who had lost everything. You look at what was and see ruins. You see waste. You see consequences of your own bad decisions. And you think, God will never use me again. I burned my opportunities. But then, somehow unexpectedly, God opens a door. Not exactly what you lost, but something new, something you didn't expect. Billy Graham explained, "From that failure, God builds something better, not because you deserve it, but because He is merciful. And when you remember how God lifted you from that failure, you'll stop doubting whether He can take you to things greater than you ever imagined." Ideal, depression, and darkness. There are those who were in such a dark place they almost didn't come back. Depression, anxiety, hopelessness. Billy Graham preached, "You know what it's like when life loses its color, when nothing means anything, when you wake up and don't want to wake up, when you see the future and only see darkness." He had tears in his eyes when he preached to people in these circumstances. But you're still here. You didn't give up. You came today to this event. And the reason you're here is because God brought you through that darkness. He sustained you. He didn't abandon you. And when that person in their future again feels depression coming, because it comes back sometimes, they remember, God pulled me out of there once. He can pull me out again. Billy Graham concluded, "When you remember the darkest place you've been and see that God brought you out of there, you'll stop doubting whether He can take you to the light." But Billy Graham identified something crucial that many people miss. They don't recognize the miracle while it's happening. You're being removed from the darkness, but you still feel the pain. You still feel the trauma. You still feel the wound. Billy Graham preached, "Often you don't realize you were pulled from the abyss because you're still feeling the effects of the abyss. You're still bleeding, you're still wounded, you're still frightened." But Billy Graham insisted, "That's the evidence, that's the sign of the miracle. You're here. You survived. You were saved." He used the illustration of a man who falls into a deep well. The well is dark, it's damp, it's cold. The walls are solid rock. There's no visible way out. Then a rope is thrown down. The man grabs the rope and begins to be pulled upward, but while he's ascending, he's still in the well. He can still see the well's walls. He can still feel the cold. He can still feel the pain of the rope in his hands as he climbs. Billy Graham said, "If that man looks at his injured hands and thinks, 'I'm still hurt, so I'm probably still in the well,' he doesn't see that he's being saved. He doesn't recognize the rope. He doesn't recognize the rescue. But if he looks up, sees the opening of the well approaching, feels the fresh air, and understands, 'Yes, it still hurts. Yes, I'm still scared. But I'm being pulled out of here,' then he understands the miracle." And Billy Graham continued, "So it is with your spiritual salvation. You may still be wounded. You may still be in pain. You may still be healing. But if you understand that you're being pulled out, if you recognize God's hand in your deliverance, then you see the miracle. And that miracle becomes your strongest memory." Billy Graham preached, "The memory of your rescue is more powerful than any doubt. It's stronger than any circumstance. It's more real than any doubt that comes later." Then comes the question everyone asks. If God brought me out of that place, why do I still doubt the future? Billy Graham explained that this is a natural movement, but also a spiritual mistake. He preached, as soon as God pulls us from an abyss, life gets better. Finally we have peace. Finally we have hope. And then God begins to speak about the next level, about the greater future. about the dreams he has for us. And the first reaction, doubt. But God, if it was so hard to get out of there, how will it be possible to reach where you're calling me? Billy Graham illustrated this with the story of the people of Israel. Israel was brought out of Egypt. It was a spectacular rescue. Plagues, death, hail, the Red Sea opening, the pillar of cloud, the pillar of fire, miracles impossible to deny. And then God says, I'm going to take you to a land where milk and honey flow, a land that's all yours, a fruitful land, a land of promise. And what's their reaction? Fear, doubt. But God, there are giants there. There are walled cities. There are 7 nations stronger than us. Billy Graham preached. You see, they saw God defeat Egypt, the most powerful nation in the world. They saw God open the Red Sea. But when God speaks about the future, they only see the obstacles. And that's exactly where Billy Graham's phrase comes in. When you remember where God brought you from, you'll stop doubting where God can take you. Billy Graham continued, if God was powerful enough to do this, He's powerful enough to do that. If God was faithful in previous tests, He'll be faithful in the next tests. If God loved you when you were in the abyss, He loves you when you're walking toward the future He prepared. And here Billy Graham pointed to a central problem of modern faith. We tend to apply 2 different measures to God. In the past, we say, God was powerful, God was real, God acted. But in the future, we say, but what if God doesn't sustain me? What if God abandons me? What if it's too difficult? That's an insult to God. It's saying God was powerful yesterday, but maybe not today. It's saying God was faithful then, but maybe not now. Billy Graham concluded, consistent faith says, the God who brought me out of there is the same God who will take me where I need to go. He hasn't changed. He hasn't weakened. He's no less faithful. When you finally understand this truth, that the God of your past is the God of your future, something changes. Doubt begins to have less power over you. Billy Graham preached, you know why many people don't live their dreams? Not because God doesn't have them. Not because God isn't capable. It's because they're paralyzed by doubt. And doubt comes from forgetting where God brought them from. He told stories of people who lived lives much smaller than God had for them, simply because they didn't believe God could do more. The man who was afraid to share his faith because he feared rejection. But Billy Graham asked him, did God reject you when you were at the bottom? No, the man replied. Then why do you think He'll reject you when you're trying to serve Him? Billy Graham preached, when you remember where God brought you from, you'll stop doubting. And when you stop doubting, you'll begin to dare. Daring is the first step to fulfilling your destiny. The woman who had dreamed of serving in missions but was afraid of leaving everything behind, afraid of the unknown, afraid of not being enough. Billy Graham said, you survived in the abyss. You were sustained by God while you were there. You were freed when it seemed impossible to be freed. And now you're afraid that God can't sustain you in a fertile land, in a planned future. Your memory should be screaming, if God was faithful when everything was against me, He'll be faithful when everything is in my favor. And Billy Graham explained, here's the secret. Your past story is the prophecy of your future. The miracles God performed in you aren't just to make you feel better. They're a glimpse of what God wants to do through you. They're the foundation upon which God will build your future. He preached. You're not just someone who was saved. You're someone God will use to save others. You're not just someone who was restored. You're someone God will use to restore others. You're not just someone who found hope. You're someone who will give hope to others. And it all begins when you remember where God brought you from and stop doubting where God can take you. Dies. Billy Graham didn't leave this as just a concept. He taught how to practice it. He preached, spiritual memory is like a muscle. It needs to be exercised. If you don't exercise it, it atrophies. He taught people to do something he called a grace review. Set aside time, weekly or at least monthly, and make a list, not on your phone, on paper. Write, where did God bring me from? What seemed impossible? How did God act? What miracles did I see? Billy Graham explained, when you write, you're not just remembering, you're recording. You're creating a document you can look at whenever doubt tries to rise. He preached, and then when a new situation arises, when you face a new challenge, when fear tries to paralyze you, you grab that paper, you read, you remember. And you say, God, you've already proven you're faithful. You've already proven you're powerful. You've already proven you love me. So I'm going to trust you now. I'm going to walk toward what you're calling me to, because you've brought me out of situations worse than this. Billy Graham emphasized, it's as simple as that, but it's profound because it's grounded in something real, not in feelings, not in fragile hope, but in facts. In miracles you've seen, in interventions you've experienced. He preached, that's true faith. It's not believing in something you haven't seen. It's believing in something you've already seen God do and trusting He'll do it again. Billy Graham was honest. Even having this truth, doubt can return, because life continues to bring challenges. New mountains appear, new tests arise, and it's easy to get lost in doubt again. He preached, you may be living the new future God prepared. You may be seeing miracles happen, but then a disappointment comes, a failure, a loss. And you think, is God really with me? Billy Graham said, this is the moment when you need to return to your memory, that paper, that record of where God brought you from, that list of miracles. And you'll read and remember, oh yes, God was with me. God has been with me all along. He didn't give up on me in the abyss. He won't give up on me here. He preached, doubt won't completely go away. That's an aspect of life in faith. But when doubt comes, you have something to hold on to. You have the memory, and memory is more powerful than fear. Billy Graham concluded, if you can look back once and see where God brought you from, you can look forward with hope to where God will take you. Because the God of your past is the God of your future, and He never changes. So here's the question Billy Graham asked at the end of every sermon with this message. Where did God bring you from? Think about it. Really think. Close your eyes. Go back 4, 5, 10 years. Remember that place. Remember that desperation. You're here now. You survived. You were saved. That wasn't chance. That was God. And if God brought you out of there, He can take you where He's calling you. Where are you doubting now? What's the dream you let die because you think God can't do it? What's the mountain you're looking at and thinking it's too big? Billy Graham said, "Bring that doubt into the light. Examine it in the light of the miracles God has already performed in your life, and see how many times it disappears." Now, if this message touched your heart, if you felt God speaking to you through it, if you recognized it's time to stop doubting and start walking toward the future God prepared, then write in the comments, "I remember." It's not just an affirmation, it's a commitment. It's you saying, "I will remember. I'll remember where God brought me from. And I'll stop doubting where God can take me." And more than that, also write, where did God bring you from? What's that place you didn't know how you'd get out of, but God brought you out of there? Share your story, because there's someone reading this who's doubting, someone who thinks their future is impossible, someone who needs to remember that God is faithful. And your testimony might be exactly what that person needs to hear. Billy Graham spent his life bringing people to Jesus, helping them remember that God is real. And you can continue that ministry simply by sharing your memory of where God brought you from. It doesn't need to be long. It doesn't need to be perfect. Just be honest and real. Share this video with someone who's doubting, someone who needs to be reminded that God is faithful, someone who needs to see the connection between where God brought them from and where God can take them. Because Billy Graham's message continues to be as powerful today as when he preached it. When you remember where God brought you from, you'll stop doubting where God can take you. So remember, write, "I remember," in the comments. Share where God brought you from, and let your memory be the bridge that leads someone from fear to faith, from doubt to certainty, from paralysis to purpose. You were saved. You were restored. You were remolded. Now walk toward the future God prepared for you, because the God who was faithful yesterday is faithful today and will be faithful tomorrow.